The city was still wrapped in the quiet embrace of dawn. The streets of Manhattan remained mostly empty, with only the occasional early riser or a passing taxi disturbing the stillness. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew-covered grass from Central Park. It was an ordinary morning, or so it seemed. A lone cyclist pedaled leisurely through the park, following his usual route. His tires crunched against the gravel path, the rhythmic hum of the wheels blending with the distant chirping of birds. He had taken this route hundreds of times before, a peaceful escape from the chaos of city life. But that morning something felt different. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, a quiet that felt too heavy. As he approached a wooded area near the Metropolitan Museum of Art, something caught his eye. A shape sprawled on the ground beneath a large tree. At first he thought it was someone sleeping, perhaps a homeless person seeking refuge in the park. But as he got closer, dread tightened in his chest. The figure wasn't moving. His breath hitched. His hands trembled as he pulled his bike to a stop and hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. The early morning light cast eerie shadows through the trees, making it difficult to see clearly. Then the realization struck him like a hammer. It wasn't just a person lying there. It was a woman, and she wasn't sleeping. She was young, no older than her early 20s. Her body was partially exposed, her clothes disheveled. There were bruises along her arms and neck, deep, dark imprints of force. But what horrified him the most was her face. Her eyes were open, glassy, staring at nothing. Her lips slightly parted as if she had tried to say something in her last moments. The man stumbled backward, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. He fumbled for his pockets, pulling out his phone with shaking hands, and dialed emergency services. His voice was unsteady, breaking as he described what he saw. "There's a girl. I think she's dead. She's in Central Park, near the museum." Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as they approached. The familiar red and blue flashes painted the trees in sharp, flickering hues. Officers rushed onto the scene, their footsteps heavy against the damp ground. A detective, wearing a trench coat despite the mild morning, surveyed the area with a sharp, assessing gaze. The first responders confirmed what was already clear. She was gone. The detective knelt beside the body, scanning the scene with practiced precision. A crime scene technician snapped photos, capturing every detail: the position of the body, the disturbed soil beneath her, the scattered belongings. Nothing could be left unnoticed. "Do we have an ID?" one of the officers asked. A wallet was retrieved from the grass nearby. Inside was a driver's license, the photo showing a young woman with bright eyes and a confident smile. The name printed beneath it sent a shiver through those present. Jennifer Levin. A name that, within hours, would dominate the headlines. A name that would soon be spoken with both sorrow and outrage. The detective took a slow breath. This wasn't a random attack. The scene lacked the chaos of an ambush, the frantic signs of a robbery gone wrong. This was different. There was a story here, a story buried beneath the bruises, hidden in the last hours of Jennifer Levin's life, and the hunt for the truth had just begun. Jennifer Levin had been many things: daughter, friend, dreamer. She had the kind of presence that lit up a room, the kind of energy that made people gravitate toward her. Those who knew her would say she was full of life, a free spirit with a wild, untamed ambition. She had grown up in an affluent New York family, attended prestigious schools, and was preparing for the next stage of her life. There had been nothing extraordinary about her background. No dark secrets lurking in her past. Just an 18-year-old girl on the brink of adulthood, eager to experience the world. Her days had been filled with laughter, late-night phone calls with friends, afternoons spent at cafes on the Upper East Side, and weekends slipping into bars where doormen barely glanced at her fake ID. It was the 1980s, an era of excess and indulgence, where the children of Manhattan's elite roamed the city freely, shielded by privilege and a sense of invincibility. Jennifer had been part of that world, a world where fun was the only currency that mattered, where the night never seemed to end. The night before her death had been no different. She had been out with friends at Dorian's Red Hand, a well-known bar where young socialites gathered, drinking and flirting, until the early hours of the morning. The place was packed, laughter spilling out onto the streets, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the lingering scent of alcohol. Jennifer had been seen there, smiling, talking animatedly, lost in the carefree energy of youth. But at some point, the night had taken a turn. Witnesses recalled her leaving with someone, a familiar face, a name that wouldn't mean much in that moment, but would soon become infamous. Hours later, she was found lifeless beneath the shadows of the trees in Central Park. The stark contrast between the vibrant young woman from the night before and the cold, lifeless figure found in the park was haunting. The media would later paint Jennifer as reckless, as someone who had made a fatal mistake by trusting the wrong person, but those who knew her would argue otherwise. She hadn't been careless, just young, just someone who believed the city was hers to explore. That danger was something that happened to other people. Her parents had been notified before the news broke to the public. The phone call no parent should ever receive. The moment where time stops, where reality fractures into something unrecognizable. They had been expecting to see their daughter walk through the door that morning, perhaps hungover from the night before, maybe rolling her eyes at whatever lecture they were about to give her. Instead, they were left staring at the empty space where she should have been. The city woke up to the news, headlines screaming about the tragedy, reporters scrambling to piece together the last known moments of her life. The police, already under pressure, moved swiftly. A young woman murdered in Central Park wasn't something that could be ignored. This wasn't just another crime. This was a story that would grip the entire city. As detectives reviewed the case, the first pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Jennifer hadn't been alone when she left the bar. She had been seen with a young man, tall, well-dressed, someone who blended in seamlessly with the privileged crowd at Dorian's Red Hand. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone who had followed her out of nowhere. He was part of the same social circle. That was what made it all the more chilling. Because if someone like Jennifer Levin, someone who grew up surrounded by wealth and comfort, someone who had walked these same streets 100 times without fear, could be killed in such a brutal manner, then no one was safe. The city had seen crime before. New York in the 1980s wasn't exactly a stranger to violence. But this was different. This wasn't a random mugging gone wrong or a senseless act of street crime. This was something personal. Someone had taken Jennifer Levin's life, and the police were about to find out who. The weight of a murder investigation is always heaviest in the first 24 hours. Every second lost is a second further from justice. In a city like New York, where crime is both expected and unavoidable, the urgency of a case like this was different. This wasn't just another statistic in an overworked precinct's backlog. This was a young woman from an affluent neighborhood, found dead in the heart of Central Park. It was a case that wouldn't and couldn't be ignored. The morning after Jennifer Levin's body was discovered, the investigation began at full speed. Detectives combed through the immediate details, trying to reconstruct the last moments of her life. Who had seen her last? Where had she been? What had happened between the time she left Dorian's Red Hand and the moment her life was taken? The first pieces of the puzzle were slowly emerging, but none of them provided immediate answers, only more questions. One fact stood out. Jennifer hadn't left the bar alone. Witnesses recalled seeing her with someone, a young man she had known, someone she had been seen with before. His name was not yet public knowledge, but in the precinct, officers were already whispering. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some unknown threat lurking in the dark. It was someone from her world. As police reviewed the security footage from outside the bar, the grainy black and white images confirmed what witnesses had already said. Jennifer had exited the building just before 4:30 a.m., walking alongside a tall, well-dressed young man. The two appeared comfortable with each other, not hurried or distressed. If anything, it looked like they were simply continuing their night elsewhere. There was no struggle, no sign of danger. It was, by all appearances, just another night out in the city, but by sunrise, Jennifer was dead. The man in the footage had been identified within hours. His name was Robert Chambers, a 19-year-old who, on the surface, fit seamlessly into the same privileged world Jennifer had belonged to. He was good-looking, with an easy charm and a reputation for knowing exactly what to say to the right people. But beneath the polished exterior, there were cracks. Robert had a past, one that wasn't immediately obvious, but once uncovered, painted a picture far more complicated than his appearance suggested. He had grown up in privilege, but had a troubled history, a string of disciplinary issues, and a reputation that wasn't as clean as it seemed. He was known for his charm, but also for his temper. He had been given second chances before, but had never seemed to take them. That morning, while detectives gathered evidence at the crime scene, others were sent to track down Robert Chambers. They needed to hear his side of the story. They needed to know what had happened after he and Jennifer left the bar together. They needed answers. Robert was found at an Upper East Side apartment, staying with a friend. When police arrived, he didn't seem surprised. If anything, he seemed prepared, as if he had been expecting them. He agreed to come in for questioning without resistance. At first, his demeanor was calm. He told detectives that he had been with Jennifer that night, but that they had parted ways. He didn't know what had happened to her after that. He was careful with his words, measured in his tone, as if each sentence had been rehearsed. He insisted that he had nothing to hide. But there was something else, something that made the detectives hesitate. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. A slight shift in his posture, a flicker of hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided eye contact just long enough to raise suspicion. And then there were the scratches. His hands, his arms, even his face, marked with fresh, raw scratches. When asked about them, Robert barely hesitated before answering. "My cat," he said. "She scratches me all the time." It wasn't a bad excuse. Under normal circumstances, it might have been believable. But these weren't just random scratches. They were deep, deliberate, like someone had been fighting back. And Jennifer Levin had fought for her life. The forensic team was already examining her body, the bruises, the defensive wounds, the evidence of a struggle. It all told a different story than the one Robert was giving them. But for now, the detectives listened. They let him talk. They let him explain, because they knew something he didn't. The truth was beginning to surface. The interrogation room had an atmosphere all its own. It wasn't just the pale, lifeless walls or the way fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting stark shadows that made even the most innocent person look guilty. It was something deeper, something psychological. The weight of it was suffocating. No one walked into that room and left unchanged. Robert Chambers sat in one of the cold metal chairs, his back straight but not too rigid, trying to appear cooperative but not nervous. He had been in there for less than an hour, but the weight of the detectives' stares made it feel much longer. He wasn't under arrest, at least not yet, but he knew what this was. He knew what they were thinking. Across the table, the lead detective kept his expression unreadable, watching Robert carefully. They had already seen the security footage. They had already spoken to witnesses. Robert was the last person seen with Jennifer Levin, and now she was dead. That alone didn't make him guilty, but the scratches on his arms, his face, the faint bruises along his wrists, those told a different story. He had an explanation, of course. "My cat did it," he had said earlier, almost too quickly. It wasn't the worst excuse, but it wasn't good either. Cats scratched in erratic patterns, jagged, unpredictable marks. But the scratches on Robert's skin were different. They ran in straight, desperate lines, deep enough to leave behind evidence under a girl's fingernails. Forensics was already examining Jennifer's body. They had collected her nails, her skin, the fibers tangled in her clothing. They were running tests that would tell a story far more reliable than any alibi. But those results weren't back yet. What they had for now was time. Time to let Robert talk. Time to let him weave a story, because the longer someone talks, the easier it is to spot the holes. He repeated what he had already said, that he and Jennifer had left the bar together, that they had walked to Central Park, that they had talked for a while. Then he claimed they had parted ways. He didn't know what had happened to her after that. It was a clean answer. Too clean. The detectives pressed for details. What had they talked about? What time had they parted ways? Had they argued? The questions were gentle at first, almost casual, but casual was dangerous in an interrogation room. Casual made people slip up. Robert's answers became less steady. He fumbled slightly over the timeline, corrected himself mid-sentence, then corrected himself again. He claimed they had been in the park only briefly, 15, maybe 20 minutes. The detectives knew this wasn't true. Jennifer's body had been found at first light, meaning she had been in the park for hours. And if Robert had left her there, why had no one seen her wandering alone? Why had there been no further sightings, no sounds of distress? A young woman doesn't simply disappear into the dark without someone noticing. The tension in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Robert sensed it too. He tried to lean back, to regain some sense of control, but the air had thickened around him. His scratches, his shifting timeline, the inconsistencies in his version of events. They were all adding up, but not in his favor. Still, he wasn't breaking. Not yet. The detectives knew they couldn't push too hard too soon. They had no physical evidence linking him to the crime, at least not yet. For now, they let him go. As he walked out of the precinct that day, reporters were already beginning to gather outside, the news of Jennifer Levin's death spreading fast. Cameras flashed, voices shouted questions. Robert didn't stop to answer. He kept walking, jaw tight, hands clenched. But inside the police station, the case against him was only just beginning. The body never lies. It holds secrets beneath the skin, silent but unrelenting, waiting for someone to listen. In life, a person can obscure the truth, weave false narratives, hide behind carefully chosen words. But in death, the body betrays everything. Every struggle, every moment of terror, every act of violence inflicted upon it. Jennifer Levin had fought. That much was clear. The scratches on Robert Chambers' arms were not from a cat, as he had casually suggested. They were too uniform, too deliberate. They ran in straight lines, dug deep into the flesh, desperate. A struggle had taken place, one where she had clawed at him, grasping at anything to break free. The forensic team was already analyzing the material under her fingernails, and soon there would be answers. The medical examiner's office was a stark contrast to the noise of the city outside. The room was quiet, clinical. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as forensic pathologists moved with the precision of surgeons. Every mark on Jennifer's body was cataloged, measured, and studied. The bruising around her neck was unmistakable, a clear sign of strangulation. But it wasn't just strangulation. The depth of the bruises, the distinct imprints of fingers pressing into her skin, suggested prolonged force. This had not been a moment of lost control, a fleeting burst of rage. It had taken time. It had taken effort. The bruises weren't just on her neck. There were marks on her wrists, signs of restraint, and abrasions on her legs and torso, indicating a violent struggle. There was no sign of a weapon being used. This had been done entirely by hand. Personal, intimate. The kind of crime where the attacker wanted to feel the life leaving their victim. Toxicology tests were routine in cases like these. Blood samples were taken, checked for alcohol, drugs, anything that might have impaired judgment or altered the events of that night. The results confirmed what was already suspected. Jennifer had been drinking, but she had not been incapacitated. She had been fully aware of what was happening to her. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. The forensic team worked methodically, piecing together the final moments of her life, the position of her body, the way her clothes had been disturbed, the environmental evidence clinging to her skin and hair. It all told a story Jennifer herself could no longer tell, but the evidence would. Meanwhile, at the precinct, detectives pored over witness statements, trying to reconstruct the timeline with more precision. Who had seen Jennifer last? Who had seen Robert Chambers after he left the park? Was there anyone who could place him at the scene beyond the security footage showing them leaving the bar together? A new detail emerged, one that sent a ripple through the investigation. A witness, someone who had been jogging in the park early that morning, reported seeing a young man walking away from the area where Jennifer's body was found. He had been moving quickly, his posture tense. He hadn't looked lost or confused, nor had he seemed like someone out for an early morning stroll. He had looked like someone who wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. The witness couldn't be sure of the exact time, but it was close enough to align with the suspected time frame of Jennifer's death. When shown a photograph of Robert Chambers, they hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, that was him. It wasn't definitive proof. Not yet. But it was another crack in Robert's story. He had said he left Jennifer and went home. But if that was true, why had he been seen in the park at that hour? Why had he been walking away from the very place her body was found? Back at the medical examiner's office, the final report was nearly complete. The cause of death was clear. The timeline of injuries, the pattern of bruising, the defensive wounds, all of it pointed to a violent confrontation. The body had spoken, and now it was time for the investigation to listen. In any murder investigation, there is a tipping point, a moment when the weight of the evidence begins to collapse in on itself, shifting the balance from suspicion to certainty. The early stages of the case are often chaotic, filled with speculation, conflicting reports, and theories that pull in every possible direction. But then, the facts begin to settle into place. The puzzle pieces, once scattered, start to fit together. And when they do, the picture that emerges is undeniable. For the detectives assigned to Jennifer Levin's case, that moment was fast approaching. The forensic team had completed their report. Every detail of Jennifer's body had been examined, analyzed, and cross-referenced with the timeline constructed from witness statements, security footage, and Robert Chambers' own account of the night. And the results were damning. The bruising on Jennifer's neck, the deep impressions left by fingers pressing down with force, told a story that no amount of denial could erase. This had not been a brief, impulsive act. Strangulation takes time. It requires sustained pressure, a conscious effort to overpower another human being. The marks left behind revealed a grim truth. Whoever had killed Jennifer had done so with intent. Her defensive wounds painted an equally horrifying picture. The scratches on Robert's arms and face weren't incidental. They weren't the result of a playful struggle or a fleeting moment of rough intimacy. They were deliberate, desperate. Jennifer had fought, clawing at the hands around her throat, trying to pry them away, trying to breathe. And then there was the DNA. Underneath Jennifer's fingernails, forensic analysts had discovered traces of skin, small but significant. When tested, the results confirmed what the detectives had suspected all along. The DNA belonged to Robert Chambers. At that moment, the investigation shifted. No longer was this a case of circumstantial evidence or suspicious behavior. This was now about science, about undeniable proof that Jennifer had been in a fight for her life, and that Robert had been the one she had fought against. But there was still more to uncover. The detectives returned to Dorian's Red Hand, retracing Jennifer's last hours. They spoke to bartenders, other patrons, anyone who had seen her that night. More details emerged, conversations she had with friends, brief exchanges that, in the moment, had seemed meaningless but now carried weight. One patron remembered seeing Jennifer and Robert together, noting that while she appeared engaged in conversation, something about his demeanor had seemed off. He had been drinking heavily, growing increasingly agitated throughout the night. Witnesses recalled an argument, though the details were unclear. What was certain was that when Jennifer left with him, she hadn't seemed distressed, which meant something had changed between the moment they walked out of the bar and the moment she died. The detectives knew they needed to bring Robert back in for questioning. They had let him go once, but that was before the autopsy results, before the DNA, before the witness who had placed him at the scene of the crime. Walking away from the park in the early morning hours, his movements hurried and tense. The moment had come to confront him with the evidence. They arrived at the Upper East Side apartment where he had been staying. This time he didn't seem quite as composed. His confidence had frayed at the edges, the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. But still he maintained his innocence. As they escorted him back to the precinct, the streets outside were different from before. The news of Jennifer's murder had spread, and the press was relentless. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. "Robert, did you kill Jennifer Levin? Do you have anything to say to her family?" He kept his head down, pushing through the crowd. But the walls were closing in, and this time, there would be no walking away. The walls of the interrogation room had a way of making time feel distorted. The absence of windows, the stark fluorescent lighting, the monotony of gray walls, it all blurred together, stretching minutes into hours, hours into something unmeasurable. This was a space designed to break people down, to strip away their defenses, to push them toward the inevitable truth. Robert Chambers sat at the steel table, his hands resting in front of him, fingers occasionally tapping against the cold surface. It was a nervous tick, small but telling. The first time he had been here, he had exuded confidence, even a hint of arrogance. He had given the detectives just enough information to seem cooperative, but not enough to incriminate himself. Back then, they had nothing concrete, just suspicion, circumstantial evidence, and the uncomfortable feeling that his story didn't quite add up. Now things were different. Detectives laid the autopsy report on the table, a thick folder filled with pages of medical findings, detailed photographs, forensic evidence. They didn't open it immediately. They let its presence sink in. They wanted him to know that whatever he had said before, whatever story he had told, was now in direct conflict with science. Jennifer Levin had died by strangulation. That was now an irrefutable fact. The deep bruising around her neck showed sustained pressure, not an accident, not a momentary lapse of control. The defensive wounds on her hands and arms proved that she had fought back. And the DNA under her fingernails? That was the final nail in the coffin. Robert shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. He didn't ask to see the report, didn't reach for the file. But he didn't look away from it either. The detectives started slowly, reviewing the night in question. The witnesses at Dorian's Red Hand, the security footage of him leaving with Jennifer, the jogger in Central Park who had seen him walking away from the scene at a suspicious hour. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the night, filling in the blanks that his initial statement had conveniently left out. Robert's earlier claim, that he and Jennifer had parted ways amicably in the park, was now impossible to believe. The forensic evidence contradicted it. The timeline didn't support it. The witnesses put him there, at the time of the crime, with no explanation as to why he had been seen leaving in such a hurried manner. They didn't outright accuse him, not yet. They wanted him to feel the weight of the evidence pressing down on him, to let it settle in his mind. Still, he didn't speak. He didn't lash out. He just sat there, quiet, calculating. But silence in an interrogation room was as revealing as words. Outside, the case was becoming a media storm. The murder of a young woman from the Upper East Side, the arrest of a handsome, privileged young man. This was a story the press couldn't resist. Reporters swarmed the precinct, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, each journalist hungry for a statement, a headline, a soundbite. Jennifer's family had already spoken to the press, their grief raw and unfiltered. They wanted justice. They wanted the world to know that their daughter hadn't just been another victim, another statistic. She had been a person, a sister, a daughter, a friend. And now she was gone. Inside the interrogation room, Robert still hadn't said a word. The detectives let the silence stretch. They had all the time in the world, and they knew that sooner or later, the truth would have nowhere left to hide. Interrogation is a psychological battlefield. It is not just about asking questions and waiting for answers. It is about control, about pressure, about knowing exactly when to push and when to pull back. The walls of the room are not just physical barriers. They are tools, silent enforcers of isolation, creating a space where truth has nowhere to hide. Robert Chambers had been in this room before, but this time was different. The air felt heavier, thick with an unspoken certainty that had not been there in his first round of questioning. The detectives were no longer circling suspicion. They had arrived at something definitive. The file sitting on the table between them wasn't just a collection of theories. It was evidence, proof. And Robert knew it. He had maintained his silence for a long time, refusing to engage beyond the minimal cooperation required to keep himself from looking overtly guilty. But silence in an interrogation was rarely a sign of confidence. It was a delay tactic, a way to buy time, and time was running out. The detectives reviewed the case methodically, laying out the facts once again, not in an accusatory tone, but with the detached precision of someone recounting an undeniable sequence of events. Jennifer Levin had been alive and well when she left Dorian's Red Hand with Robert Chambers. She had not been under duress, had not appeared intoxicated beyond control. She had willingly walked out with him, just as she had done on other occasions. But hours later, she was dead. The autopsy had ruled out any other possibilities. The bruising on her neck told the story of strangulation, prolonged, forceful, There had been no hesitation in the act, no sign that it had been an accident. It took strength to kill someone in that way. More importantly, it took time. Jennifer had fought. The scratches on Robert's face, the defensive wounds on her hands, these were not the marks of a passive encounter gone wrong. These were the marks of a woman fighting for her life, and she had left behind the evidence of that struggle in the form of his DNA under her nails. The detectives let this reality settle in the room, giving Robert space to react, to absorb the gravity of what he was being confronted with. But he remained still, his expression unreadable. There was no way out now, but still he resisted. His first instinct had been denial. He had insisted that he had left Jennifer alive, that whatever happened to her afterward had nothing to do with him. But the timeline had shattered that story. Then came the excuse of self-defense, a desperate attempt to shift the narrative. Maybe Jennifer had attacked him first. Maybe things had gotten out of hand. Maybe it had all been a terrible mistake. But the evidence did not support that version of events either. A struggle? Yes, but one that he had initiated, one that he had ended. Outside the interrogation room, the press was relentless. The murder had ignited a firestorm of media attention, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of who was involved. This was not a case of an unknown victim and an unknown perpetrator. This was a case that had struck at the heart of Manhattan's privileged youth, a story of violence lurking beneath the surface of wealth and entitlement. Jennifer Levin's face was on every newspaper, every news broadcast. She was no longer just a victim. She had become a symbol, a name that people whispered with a mixture of sorrow and outrage. And Robert Chambers? He was no longer just a suspect. He was the name attached to the whispers, the face on the other side of the headlines. The weight of it all was suffocating. But in the end, the truth had a way of breaking through even the strongest walls of resistance, and Robert Chambers was finally running out of places to hide. For days, Robert Chambers had held his ground, refusing to break under the weight of questioning. He had insisted he was innocent, that he had parted ways with Jennifer Levin and had no idea what had happened to her afterward. He had dodged, deflected, denied. But the evidence was piling up, and the walls of his carefully crafted lies were crumbling. The forensic reports had left no room for speculation. Jennifer had died by strangulation, and the defensive wounds on her body told the story of a violent struggle. The scratches on Robert's face and arms matched the desperate claw marks of someone fighting for their life. DNA analysis had confirmed that Jennifer's fingernails had torn into his skin in her final moments. Witness testimony placed him in the park at the time of the murder. The pressure was suffocating. Outside, the media frenzy was reaching its peak. The case had gripped New York, turning Jennifer Levin's murder into a national spectacle. News anchors dissected every detail, legal analysts debated possible charges, and the public watched with a morbid fascination as the case unfolded. There was no escaping the scrutiny. Robert had always been the kind of person who could charm his way out of trouble. Growing up, he had been given second chances others wouldn't have had. He had been caught stealing before, had gotten into fights, had struggled to maintain stability despite the privilege he had been born into. But there had always been someone willing to give him another opportunity, another excuse. Not this time. The detectives knew the moment was coming. The weight of the truth was pressing down on him, crushing his carefully maintained composure. He was shifting in his seat more, rubbing his face, avoiding eye contact. His breathing had changed, shorter, more erratic. And then it happened. He exhaled sharply, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the cold metal table. His shoulders sagged slightly, the first visible sign of defeat. He didn't meet the detective's eyes when he spoke. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the arrogance he had carried into the station just days before. He told them what happened, or at least his version of it. They had gone to the park together after leaving the bar. They had talked, kissed. Things had escalated. But then, according to him, Jennifer had gotten rough. She had wanted it to be aggressive, had scratched him, had pushed him. He claimed he hadn't meant to hurt her. It had been an accident, a moment that spiraled out of control. He had only been trying to stop her, to push her away. But he had pressed down too hard, for too long. The detectives didn't react. They let him talk, let him spill out the carefully edited version of events he had decided on. They knew what he was doing, trying to frame the act as something mutual, something that had simply gone too far. He wanted to blur the lines between guilt and misunderstanding, to soften the brutality of what had really happened. But the evidence didn't lie. Jennifer had not been an equal participant in whatever had happened in that park. She had fought, had struggled, had tried to survive. The marks on her body, the sheer force used to end her life, told a much darker story than the one Robert was trying to sell. But this was still a confession. Not the full truth, not an admission of intent, but it was a crack in the foundation of his defense. It was the moment they had been waiting for. Robert Chambers was no longer just a suspect. He was now a man who had admitted, in his own words, that Jennifer Levin had died at his hands. Outside the precinct, the news spread like wildfire. Reporters scrambled to get the first headlines out, the words "Robert Chambers confesses" flashing across television screens within the hour. The case had been explosive before, but now it had reached an entirely new level. Jennifer's family, who had been waiting for justice, now had confirmation of what they had already known in their hearts. Their daughter had been taken from them in an act of violence, and now the man responsible was finally being forced to face that truth. The next battle would be in the courtroom, but Robert Chambers had already lost the war. The trial of Robert Chambers was more than just a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle. The courtroom, packed with reporters, legal analysts, and the grieving family of Jennifer Levin, became the epicenter of a cultural reckoning. The case was no longer just about the tragic death of an 18-year-old girl. It had become a story about privilege, about justice, about the way society treated victims and the accused when they came from a world of wealth and entitlement. From the moment the prosecution presented its case, the evidence was overwhelming. The forensic reports detailed Jennifer's last moments, the sustained force used to strangle her, the defensive wounds that showed she had fought back. Witnesses placed Robert in the park at the time of the murder, contradicting his earlier statements. His scratches, his DNA under Jennifer's nails, the inconsistencies in his alibi, each piece of evidence layered upon the next, forming a narrative that could not be ignored. But the defense was relentless. They did what many had feared. They shifted the focus away from Robert and onto Jennifer. They painted her as wild, adventurous, someone who liked to push boundaries. They insinuated that what happened that night was not murder, but a consensual encounter that had spiraled out of control. They dissected her personal life, her relationships, the way she dressed, the way she carried herself. They turned the victim into the one on trial. For Jennifer's family, it was a second kind of brutality, one that took place not in the darkness of Central Park, but under the harsh lights of the courtroom. They watched as their daughter's life was picked apart, as her final moments were twisted into something unrecognizable. It was a tactic as old as the justice system itself. Make the victim seem complicit, make the crime seem less like a crime. But no matter how skillfully the defense tried to reshape the narrative, the facts remained. Jennifer Levin had been strangled. She had fought for her life. The man responsible sat in that courtroom, attempting to shift the blame. The prosecution pushed back with full force. They reminded the jury that Jennifer was not on trial. They brought the focus back to the evidence, the science, the timeline that proved this was no accident. Strangulation was not instantaneous. It took minutes of sustained pressure. It required intent. There was no moment of loss of control that could explain the bruises on her neck, the depth of the marks left behind. As the trial progressed, public opinion split. Some saw Robert Chambers for what he was, a man who had taken a life and now sought to escape responsibility. Others, influenced by the media's portrayal, saw a tragic misunderstanding, a young man caught in circumstances that had spiraled beyond his control. But the jury saw the truth. After deliberation, they returned with a verdict. Robert Chambers was given a plea deal, manslaughter instead of murder. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. For many, it was a devastating outcome. The brutality of the crime deserved more. Jennifer's family had fought for justice, but the legal system had given them something less than what they had hoped for. Robert was led away in handcuffs, but he was not facing life behind bars. He would have the chance to walk free again, to rebuild his life in a way Jennifer never could. Years later, when Robert was released, he would find himself back in the criminal justice system, arrested again for drug-related offenses. The patterns of his life, the entitlement, the disregard for consequences, had not changed. It was proof to many that the leniency he had received had not been justice, but an escape. Jennifer Levin's story, however, did not end in that courtroom. Her death became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the ways in which victims, especially women, were often forced to defend their own stories even in death. It sparked conversations about privilege, about accountability, about the way society viewed young men who committed violent acts versus the women who suffered because of them. Justice in its truest form had not been served, but Jennifer's name endured. Her family continued to honor her memory, ensuring that she was remembered not just as a victim, but as a person, a young woman with dreams, with a future that had been stolen from her. Her story became more than just a case file or a headline. It became a symbol of the fight for fairness, a reminder that the pursuit of justice is never just about one case, one verdict. It is about the larger battle, the ongoing struggle to make sure that the next Jennifer Levin, whoever she may be, does not become another statistic, another name lost in a system that too often fails those who need it most. The past could not be changed, but the lessons of this case would not be forgotten. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.